Hey, hello. You're stuck in traffic with Wolf Gorlick. A few minutes on IT security. There are those who are promoting active defense and zero-day protection, which is great. I particularly like active defense. I've talked about it a lot. I particularly like protecting against 0 days. However, oftentimes when you look at these, the protection against 0 days tends to be a lot of hype. And active defense tends to be nothing more than, some guys on a sim console. So today I want to look at what active defense actually is. And when I was talking about protecting against 0 days in active defense scenarios, what I meant, not, we are now immune to all 0 days. Not what I mean. So let's step back, discuss that today, and give you some thoughts that you can apply in your own environment. First, revisiting balloon tower defense. Balloon tower defense is where you have an attack path. That is the path that the balloons follow. You have your end result, right, that the criminals want to get to. That's what the balloons get. And along the way, you have monkeys shooting darts. I love balloon towers. Shooting darts to pop the balloons to make sure that they do not get to that target. Put differently, you've got an attack path, criminal intent at the end of it, and a bunch of controls along the way. Now, what active defense is, traditional defense is detection and prevention. Active defense adds a couple things to that. Taken to an extreme, it will detect, respond, and perhaps even attack back. When I'm thinking about active defense, usually what I mean is something a little bit more tighter. When I'm thinking about active defense, I'm thinking about if I had 4 hours to protect my network a week, how would I spend those 4 hours? What's the most valuable things that I could do? And some of those things would include putting in place controls that automatically respond, right? Not intrusion detection, but intrusion prevention. Such as if you've got a certain number of attempts on a web page that generates a 500, you block the IP address. You put up a honeypot, a port on a network. If someone attempts to attack or attach to that, you segment them off into a suspect and investigate VLAN. Those types of things. You may have a file on the network, right? It's labeled passwords or employee data or whatnot that is heavily monitored by file system and by your SIM, such that if anyone attempts to touch that, it immediately triggers an offense. You take these threat models, and for each one of these attacks, you create a response that's active and that can be handled and maintained in a very limited amount of time per week. 4 hours per week seems ridiculous, but in the financial services firm I worked at, that was pretty close to what it was for just maintaining the systems, not for security projects, advisement, and everything else. Just maintaining the systems. You can get it down to 4 hours if you're very, very tight. So active defense is along that balloon tower defense, along the attack path, having those controls, having an active component that responds to them. And I'm not referring to attack back. Some people do that. There's also being preemptive. That's what I would refer to as threat modeling and figuring out what that path is and looking along that path. Basically looking for controls that give you a disproportionate advantage over the attacker and require very little time. Now let's suppose that the attack includes several preventative detective steps along, right? Getting into the network, pivoting, moving across the network, getting into the system, compromising the system by vulnerability, and then getting the data, then exfiltrating the data out of the network. Here's where zero-day protection comes into play. You are still vulnerable to that 0 day. Let's put that out there. That control, if you think about a patch system, that patch is effectively, in its own way, a control, right? You've removed a vulnerability. Missing a patch is the same as having a 0 day. Do you agree? There is a known vulnerability in that system. That vulnerability, the existence of that vulnerability, does not erase the detective and preventative and responsive controls before on the path, and does not erase or remove the preventative, detective, and responsive controls after that vulnerability. So when I talk about active defense, I mean defensive controls that have an active component that are automatic and automated such that it requires a low amount of time to utilize. When I talk about 0 day defense, I mean that the 0 day, the unpatched vulnerability, is mitigated by controls before and after along that path. The vulnerability still exists. We're still going to get popped. But at least we have a fighting chance because of what comes before and what comes after. Things to do if you'd like, if you're so inclined. Google on active defense. There's a lot of good work that's been written on it. A couple papers, a couple presentations. Find out ways that you can implement these theories in your environment, not adding to your workload. Right? Simple ways that you can add a couple automated responses, fail to ban perhaps, in your environment. And as for O days, make sure that you got preventative and detective controls around your systems that function independent of whether or not the patch exists. That's it. I went long today. I'll make up for it by skipping on Thanksgiving. Have a great holiday.